Up is Adrian Das. Adrian is an ecologist, also with USGS, based at Sequoia and Kings Canyon Field Station. He studies forest dynamics with an emphasis on tree mortality.
Hello.
You're up, Adrian.
All right. So everyone can hear me, I assume? So part of this slide is a response to folks that I work with who think that I take some pleasure in the tree mortality because I find it very interesting. But more what I think is that when under a severe drought and the system's under this much stress, when you're seeing these sorts of dramatic effects on the landscape, as Nate pointed out, it's really an opportunity. And he was talking about the opportunity to, for example, do vulnerability mapping to help managers. But in another sense, it's also an opportunity to get a better idea of the mortality processes that are underlying the tree death that we see in these systems. And the obvious first application to that is that, as Nate pointed out, we may get more of these types of droughts in the future. So understanding what the mortality factors are that are causing the mortality and how those might be different during a drought could be quite important. But more broadly than that, the way we model mortality, for example, tree mortality, for example, is still fairly simplistic. We pretty much just model competition. Rarely do our models take into account things like the underlying biotic factors that might be affecting tree mortality. And drought puts the system under a lot of stress, which is a great time to see how these processes respond and indeed how they might change in the future. And that change part, I think, is pretty important to look for surprises and get a better understanding of how it works. So let me see, advancement. So Nate mentioned that we have a long-term monitoring program. We call it the Sierra Nevada Forest Dynamics Network. It consists of 30 plots. Most of them are about 1 hectare in size. Most of them are located at Sequoia National Park, but we do have 5 in Yosemite National Park. They're located along an elevational gradient from lower mixed conifer up to tree line. It's an old network. The oldest plots were established in 1982, so we have more than 30 years of data in some cases. Most of the plots were established by the early 1990s, so we have more than 20 years of data for most of the plots. In each of these plots, every tree above breast height, which is 1.37 meters, is been mapped, measured, identified to species. Every year, we revisit every one of those trees, and if they've died, we do an autopsy, basically. Pull the bark off, look for bark beetle galleries, fungal mats, anything that might have been, any factors that might have been associated with the tree's death. And if the tree's alive, we take comments on things conditions on the tree that might eventually contribute to its mortality. So basically a medical history that'll help us when we have to do our autopsies. And every 5 years or so, each tree is remeasured, so we get growth rates, and every year, any new trees that have reached breast height get measured. So we basically have the dynamics for everything above 1.37 meters anyway. And one of the unique things to point out about these plots is that it's pretty rare to have annual data. We're visiting every tree every year, and so we're usually at the tree, within a year of its mortality. So it's a unique opportunity to look at the mortality factors. So when you're heading into the 4th year of a very severe drought, which was last year, you ask the question, are we going to see really massive mortality? Are we going to see really it ramping up? As Jeff pointed out, you tend to see these things lag and ramp up as the drought progresses. And I'm showing you 2 plots that are in our lower mixed conifer zone. And here, for certain, we did see some dramatic increases. So the upper plot there, the BBB Pipo plot is, let's see if I can use the magic arrow here, is the typical mortality rates are probably about 1.5%. And we saw mortality rates in the order of 13% last year. And even more dramatically, the lower plot, the CCR Pipo plot, normal mortality rates there are around 2.5% on average, and we lost nearly 20% of the trees last year. So certainly we did see severe mortality in the drought. And I'm going to focus on these plots. These are the plots where we saw the most intense, apparently drought-related mortality, and so I'm going to look at the underlying mortality factors that seem to be associated with that mortality. But it's worth stepping back for a moment and looking at our full plot network. And this next slide, the details aren't important, but I'm showing you the same graph for all 30 plots. And there's the ones I've circled there. Those are the 2 that I just showed you. But what you can see is that None of the other plots are showing that dramatic an increase. There are some of them that are increasing, but nothing where the mortality rate is 5, 10, times its normal rate. That's not to say that our plots are probably not representative of the landscape as a whole. You need to look at, Jeff's type of aerial surveys or some of the remote sensing data that Nate was talking about to get a better idea of what the spatial distribution of the landscape is. But it does tell you that it's spatially variable. Even though we're in this very severe drought, not all parts of the landscape are experiencing it the same way. And so it's an important fact to keep in mind. It's not a homogeneous effect. So going back to the two plots where we did see the elevated drought mortality, it's worth asking, so what does the mortality look like in a drought versus non-drought period? And in the next series of slides, what I'm going to do is compare what we saw between 1998 and 2011, our sort of typical background, no really severe drought activity, and we lost 919 trees there, and compare that to what we've seen in this very severe drought in the last couple of years, where we lost 765 trees over two seasons. So the proportion of mortality is the y-axis. So keep in mind that these, one is a longer time period, but we can ask, okay, so are trees dying in the same size categories, or is it different during the drought? And you look at that graph, and you say, it's very similar to a normal set of years proportionally. Most of the trees that die are in the smaller size classes with a rapid drop-off as the trees get bigger in diameter. But there is a difference in composition. What you can see is that within those small size classes, the incense cedar is the much larger proportion of the mortality than other species. And that is a difference between the drought. So something different is going on, even though the size structure is the same. Another way to look at that is to look at the time series. So each of these graphs is a size class, is the tree mortality rate for, I'm having trouble dragging my green arrow, but there we go. So each panel is our trees within a size class. It's the annual mortality rate from the early 90s and through the present drought. And what you can see is that the red lines there, the thick black line is the average mortality rate for the plot. And the other colors, which aren't quite as clear on this figure as in my original presentation, but are other species. And the red line is incense cedar, which, if you notice in the smaller size classes, tends to actually be lower than the average through most years, but is experiencing dramatic increases in the last couple. Now, all the species are showing increases in mortality rate during the drought, but clearly in the smaller size class, incense cedars picked up proportionally much more than the other species. But you do notice in the larger size class that pines, possibly due to bark beetle activity, are showing a big increase. So I mentioned that we do these autopsies on the trees, and we basically list all the factors we see. And you can break those into broad categories. So biotic factors are things like bark beetles, fungal pathogens, other insects, defoliators that we see on the tree. And suppression is competitive mortality. Generally, that's what it's assumed to be. And mechanical mortality are things like the tree getting crushed, broken, knocked around, basically. So the blue bars are our typical pre-drought proportions of mortalities that show a given factor. So the blue bar, so each of the bars shows of the tree mortalities that happened during that period, what percentage had a biotic factor, what percentage had suppression listed as a factor, and which had mechanical mortalities. And we see is the difference between the drought mortality, which is the red bar, is that we've seen a pretty substantial increase in the number of dead trees, the proportion of dead trees that show biotic factors. This isn't to say there's been necessarily a decline in the number of trees that are experiencing, mortality-related competition, but in that increase, the proportion that show biotic factors has gone way up. So we can drill down a little deeper then. So we can split the biotic factors into diseases, so the root pathogens, heart rots, things like that, and insects, bark beetles, and defoliators. And what you see is that, okay, so this increase in biotic factors is not occurring among the diseases. In fact, of the trees that died during the drought, a lower proportion of them have a disease listed as one of the mortality factors, but a substantial increase in the insects that are occurring on dead trees. So if we break the insects down, what we see is it's not happening in defoliators, and it's pretty typical. We don't see much defoliator-related mortality in our plots. But there's been a more than doubling of the number of dead trees that have shown bark beetle attack, which seems at first not very surprising. It's something you typically expect during a drought, but there is some surprising information there as I drill down a little deeper. The other insects are, and I'll get to what those are in a moment, but we've also seen a pretty substantial proportional increase in other insects that are attacking trees during the drought. So if we break it up by genus and start to look at within each, between pines, firs, and incense cedars, what are we seeing? Where are we seeing increases? Well, we find if you look at pines, yes, there is a high proportion of bark beetle in the trees that died, but not pretty much the same as what we saw in typical years. So bark beetles are very prevalent in the pines, but of all the dead trees that died, they're occurring in about the same proportion. But there's been a pretty substantial increase in other insects. And in this case, there's a weevil, Pisodes schwartzii, if I'm remembering correctly, that we had previously only really noticed in cankers caused by white pine blister rust. There's an exotic pathogen that attacks five-needle pines and sugar pines in this case. And this weevil would occur in the canker, and it was sort of an interesting curiosity that we'd often see. But during the last couple of years of drought, it's been occurring on its own, and not just in sugar pines, but in other small pines. And the attacks seem to be heavy enough that they appear to have killed some of the trees. So that was a surprise. We're seeing an organism that normally is an afterthought actually killing a fair number of small pines. For firs, we do see the expected increase in the proportion of bark beetle mortalities. And that's not surprising. The fir engraver, Scolitis, there's a few Scolitis species, primarily Scolitis ventralis, is known to be an opportunist when it comes to weakened trees, so you have firs that are weakened by drought, and we're seeing an increase in bark beetle activity. But incense cedar is another interesting case. There is a bark beetle that we do see in a not insignificant proportion in small cedars. And you remember that small cedars is where we're seeing these really dramatic increases in mortality in these two plots. It's a Phleocynus beetle, that's the genus. There are several species, and Martin McKenzie is actually kind of working out right now which species those are with some colleagues. But we see a more than doubling of the number of those trees that show severe Phleocynus activity. So bark beetles are having, this is again a bark beetle. It's not considered a primary bark beetle. It's considered very secondary, but it's showing up in a lot of the incense cedars that are dying. And that again was a surprise, and sort of the message of this slide is that the reason it's worth looking at the mortality factors, and particularly the biotic factors, is that there are organisms out there that we may be aware of, we might not be aware of, that might start playing a different role as climate starts to change, for example. So it's worth taking a quick look at what this might mean for forest structure and composition. And the left panel is the 1997 size structure, so at the beginning of our non-drought period, and you can see that going to 2013, we were seeing really large increases in the small size classes. There were some gaps filling in with small trees and reductions in the middle and larger size classes. Well, the drought, interestingly, has kind of knocked back that small size class to something that looks a lot more like it did 20 years ago. What that means, I guess we'll see. So, in summary, even in extreme drought, mortality is spatially variable, and Jeff probably did a better job of pointing that out with his maps. In our plots, the size structure, at least in the two plots where we were seeing elevated mortality, the size structure of mortality didn't change substantially, mostly small trees dying. Plenty of big trees dying, but not proportionally more, at least in those two plots. But the species composition did, so which trees are dying has changed during the drought. Those increases in mortality were associated with increases in biotic attack. So the drought presumably was weakening trees and allowing more biotic attack. And there's some evidence that there are activities of organisms that are normally we don't pay much attention to that might play a more significant role. And this may or may not matter for those individual species or organisms, but it points out that as conditions start to change, as things get warmer, whether it's a drought or not, we need to keep in mind that there are surprises out there, that the way we model mortality right now probably needs to start incorporating some of these other organisms, because they're going to respond to climate in a way that the trees might not. They might not be lockstep. Things that are bad for the trees might be good or bad for the organisms that attack them, and some of the ones out there that we normally don't consider. So just quickly, I think going forward, as Nate mentioned, we're going to try to tie some of our plot data to the remote sensing to see if we can start getting these health assessments for the forest at a larger scale. and maybe start getting at the spatial, what drives some of the spatial variation we see in mortality. As Jeff mentioned, lagged effects of drought are common. We're going to be interested to see what the recovery looks like, how long mortality means elevated, whether some of these other plots that didn't seem to be strongly affected show a much bigger increase in the coming years. And then we've also been looking a little bit at the temporal trends in cause of mortality. For a subset of plots, we've been going out actually every month to see which trees have died and what's killing them. And so we'll be getting into that more. And with that, I think I am done.